Hello, America. I'm Mark Levin, and this is Life, Liberty, and Levin Sunday. I'm glad you're here. Very important program. We have Newt Gingrich coming on, as well as Adam Sohn, who's going to pull the bark off of all the money coming into this country from terrorist and communist regimes, brainwashing your children and undermining our country. You're not going to want to miss that. But before we do, President Trump is trying to defend the election, your vote. He's trying to defend separation of powers in the Constitution from a judicial tyranny that is more aggressive than ever before. Justice Jackson, in these comments she made attacking Donald Trump, which I'll get to in 1 second, she's not doing anything of the kind, and neither are the judges. They are defending judicial despotism. They are defending the power that doesn't belong to them, but belongs to we, the sovereign people of the United States. There's quite a big difference between that. Among other things, the president has faced 225 lawsuits. 225 lawsuits in 100 days, interfering in foreign policy and national security, deportations, governmental spending, eliminating programs and reorganizing departments, which is his job as the executive, on transgender rights, on DEI, on tariffs, on the content of websites, on access to executive branch data and records to review it, on non-citizens voting and registering in federal elections, reductions in the federal workforce, collective bargaining agreements in the federal workforce, freezing funds to Harvard, law firms requiring them to have security clearances and check conflicts of interest, and the list goes on and on and on in these 225 cases. And these judges are abusing their power. They know they're abusing their power. They're issuing these national injunctions to cripple the executive branch, to overturn the results of an election. It is an insurrection. That's exactly what it is. And so what happens? The most radical left wing of the justices, who is Ketanji Brown Jackson, she receives a standing ovation on Thursday for trashing Donald Trump, who's defending the Constitution. Across the nation, she says, judges are facing increased threats of not only physical violence, but also professional retaliation for doing our jobs. And the attacks are not random. They seem designed to intimidate those of us who serve in this critical capacity. Although she didn't mention President Trump, Jackson's remarks were addressed to, quote, the elephant in the room following repeated attacks on the judiciary by the president, as they say. She went on for 18 minutes. Now, I want you to remember something. Justice Jackson never opened her mouth when the court was under attack by Biden, when justices were under attack, when people are in front of their homes chanting and yelling. Not once did she open her mouth when her Democrat radical left-wing friends, whether it was Biden or in Congress or anywhere else, were trying to change the makeup of the court, the construct of the Supreme Court. Not once, as a private citizen, as a lower federal judge, as a Supreme Court justice, did she open her mouth. Remember this? When Schumer attacked Kavanaugh and Gorsuch, she said nothing. Go.
I want to tell you, Gorsuch, I want to tell you, Kavanaugh, you have released the whirlwind, and you will pay the price.
She said absolutely nothing. There's a direct threat, don't you think? Donald Trump has never said anything like that, ever, about any judge, let alone a Supreme Court justice. And Schumer, the gig is up. He explained exactly what they were doing. They were packing the courts with progressives, leftists, Democrats to do exactly what they're doing. Check this out from less than a month ago. Go.
There are those who believe that we are, in real time, living through an assault on the constitutional order. Do you believe that we are in a constitutional crisis right now?
Yes, our democracy is at risk because Donald Trump shows that he wishes to violate the laws in many, many different ways. The good news here is we did put 235 judges, progressive judges, judges not under the control of Trump last year on the bench, and they are ruling against Trump time after time after time. And we hope that the appellate courts, when it gets up there in the Supreme Court, will uphold those rulings. They restored the money to NIH.
But do you remember, ladies and gentlemen, with the Dobbs decision and the leak of the draft, how the Supreme Court justices were treated and how silent Joe Biden was? I don't remember Justice Jackson opening her mouth about any of that either. And the constant, unrelenting attack on the Supreme Court and the justices. the defaming and the smearing of the court by Joe Biden. He did it his entire term. Check this out. Go.
President Biden doesn't have a view on whether or not protesters ought to show up at the private homes of Supreme Court justices. Watch this.
The president believes in peaceful protest. He believes that's part of our democracy and part of the history of the United States and this country. But he also respects and understands the independence of the third branch of government and, I mean, obviously the Justice Department, but also the role of the Supreme Court and what they play. So I wouldn't say he has a view on that.
Pro-life is a lie! You don't care if people die! Pro-life is a lie! You don't care if people die! No justice! No peace! No justice! No peace! No peace!
Decision to overturn Roe v. Wade, the Supreme Court majority wrote the following, and with all due respect, justices, women are not without electoral power. Electoral or political power. You're about to realize just how much you were right about that. Clearly, for all practical purposes, today's decision almost certainly means that there are virtually no limits on what a president can do. This is a fundamentally new principle, and it's a dangerous precedent, because the power of the office will no longer be constrained by the law, even including the Supreme Court of the United States. The only limits will be self-imposed by the president alone.
President Biden, the Congressional Black Caucus said the Supreme Court has thrown into question its own legitimacy. Is this a rogue court?
This is not a normal court.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, it was even worse than that. Here I have in front of me the Presidential Commission on the Supreme Court of the United States. Now, it was almost 300 pages long. Why is a president putting a commission together on the Supreme Court of the United States? Read your Constitution. He has no ability to do anything on the Supreme Court of the United States. Congress has power to limit or increase the number of justices on the court. That's the only power they have when it comes to the Supreme Court. Of course, they create the lower courts and have a lot more power with regard to them. But a presidential commission on the Supreme Court, this was an intimidation tactic. And it was done through an executive order, 14023, and they issued the report in December 2021, almost 300 pages, endless number of advisors, endless number of topics. They're investigating the Supreme Court of the United States to intimidate it, And that's all they do. And Justice Jackson never opened her mouth as a lower federal court judge or as a Supreme Court justice. And neither did all the clapping seals judges who were applauding her a few days back. CNN, Biden calls for major Supreme Court reforms, including term limits and so forth. July 29, 2024, he called for major Supreme Court reforms, including, in addition to term limit, binding code of conduct for the High Court. It's a separation of powers, by the way. Politico, June 2024. The president appeared at a star-studded fundraiser in Los Angeles that raised record sums, about $30 million, and Biden rips into the Supreme Court, calls appointments one of the scariest part of the second Trump term. And it's more than that. Here we have Biden says Supreme Court is out of control, orders HHS to protect abortion rights. It's out of control. July 8, 2022. Biden issues Supreme Court warning. Biden urged to take a blowtorch to the Supreme Court after the Roe ruling. That is 2022. It's not just related to Roe. You've got it related to the student loans. You've got it related to immigration. Politico. Biden rips into the Supreme Court. What else? Newsweek. Biden steps up attack on the Supreme Court. Biden's dangerous Supreme Court criticism unprecedented, experts say. More, BBC, Biden criticizes extreme Supreme Court and push for reform. You know, President Trump has never done any of this. He defends the presidency, the Constitution, separation of powers, and we the people and our votes, our franchise, against out-of-control judges. It's a completely different argument that Trump's making. Trump is making a fundamental argument about the construct of our government and the Constitution. Jackson and her leftist buddies and Biden and the Democrats are attacking the independence of the judicial system. Schumer just admits we put 225 progressives, a.k.a. radical leftists, on the court to thwart Trump in case he got elected. There's a completely different approach. One is evil, theirs. One is good, Trump's. Trump's not seeking to pack a court. He hasn't done any of that. But let's go on. NBC News 2024, Senate Democrats blast Supreme Court's ethical crisis as investigations conclude. A lengthy investigation by Senate Democrats into alleged ethical lapses by Supreme Court justices has ended the release of a report. Of course, they kept Sotomayor out of it, and she's the most unethical of all the justices. Democrats bemoan the fact that Chief Justice Roberts declined to speak to the Judiciary Committee, which is chaired by Senator Richard Durbin, a hack who's retiring. But the Chief Justice shouldn't lower himself to get involved in the politics of Congress. They also called for Congress to pass a law to put in place a more rigorous code. Congress can't put a more rigorous code in place. It's the Supreme Court of the United States. That is, it's an independent judicial system. So while they pretend to support an independent judicial system, what they really mean is we're going to attack these conservative justices. We're going to attack the independence of the court. We're not just going to attack their rulings. We want to completely change it. Why? Because Woodrow Wilson, the first of the early progressives, said our power comes through the courts, our judges, the unelected elements of the government. We must create this massive administrative state. Who's taking on the administrative state? Trump, Musk, the administration, who you elected to do exactly that. And all these lawsuits are intended to thwart them, to stop them from cutting spending, from cutting the workforce, from reducing the size of government, from eliminating programs. They're trying to freeze them in place to serve the interests of the Democrat Party. That's their power base, not we the people, government. And they have their judges in place. Woodrow Wilson told them, put your judges in place. FDR, when he came to the Supreme Court and pushing through his New Deal, well, a lot of the justices said, that's socialism, that's not supported by the Constitution. So he sought to crush the Supreme Court, destroy its independence, the first president of the United States to seek to pack the court. It was so bad that the Democrats then said no. Today, the Democrats say yes, because they've changed 100%. They're now of the American Marxist one-party rule ideology. Trump is fighting it. Trump's standing up to it. You literally have a Supreme Court justice that comes off her cloud and speaks to a group and makes a public political speech she knows the media will love, because the media hate us too, trashing the effort of the President of the United States, who is under attack by these progressive judges. The truth is, if we had a functioning judiciary, she would be forced to resign. That's how bad what she said is. That's how out of control and out of line her comments were. You have something to say, you save it for your opinions. And I can't wait to read your opinion, in which you explain to the American people how their vote doesn't matter, how the president has to beg and look over his shoulder to make for 225 progressive judges agree with what he has to say. I can't wait for your opinion to show us where that is in the Constitution. It's nowhere in the Constitution. You're defending a post-constitutional, all-powerful judiciary. That's despotism. Here's another one, Fox News. Democrats attack conservative Supreme Court justices, but have long ignored liberal justices' ethical issues. Here we have Politico. Dems revive calls for Clarence Thomas's resignation. Right. Well, I'll start my call for Jackson's resignation. What do we have here? Democrats attack Clarence Thomas's wife, which they constantly do, Ginny Thomas, in a bid for his recusal from the Trump case. Newsweek, 40 years, as I said, of attacks and slurs against Thomas. 40 years against a black justice, a conservative, a constitutionalist, a patriot. Newsweek, what the disgusting racism against Justice Thomas reveals about the anti-racist side, so-called, an opinion piece. Now they hate Alito, see, because he was the author of the Dobbs decision. Oh, we got to get Alito. Get him. What do we do? Smear the hell out of him. the Hill, Justice Alito infuriates Democrats with upside-down flag. It's alarming. It's appalling. The same Democrats who defend the Nazis in our streets, the same Democrats who defend a wife beater, the same Democrats that defend Hamas and tell us it's free speech. So his wife puts a flag up, flying upside down, and it's a national scandal. Sick. Sick. 48 House Democrats, Huffington Post, call on Samuel Alito to recuse himself from the January 6 cases because his wife flew a flag that a lot of people fly, but they were carrying her around. He's got to recuse himself. That wife of his, what is she doing with that flag? Networks rally to run new Alito conspiracy theory up the flagpole. Newsbusters, because they all are one and the same. Now let's talk about attacks on the court. I just laid out for you in about 15 minutes' time, and I could have done it all day long, on how the Democrats attack this court, on how Biden attacks the court, but they don't just attack the opinions. They're trying to destroy the independence of the court and the construct of the court and the construct of separation of powers. They want an all-powerful judiciary as long as they control it, as long as they pack it. And if you don't go along, they seek to destroy you. Clarence Thomas, Alito, other judges, and other judicial nominees. FDR tried to pack the court, not through changes by amendment to the Constitution or anything of the sort. He just wanted to pack the court to get his way. Tyrant. That was tyranny. What else has been going on with the court? How about Harry Reid and Barack Obama? Harry Reid and Barack Obama conspired to add 3 more judges on the second most powerful court. Do you remember this? The D.C. Circuit Court. That court was divided 4-4 with 6 senior status judges. Most of them were Republican. So Obama wasn't getting the rulings he wanted. So what did he do? They added 3 more judges to that court. And it didn't deserve those judges based on their workload, but Obama wanted to control the court. And so the Democrats to this day control the D.C. Court of Appeals, the appellate court, because Obama and Reid put 3 Obama leftists on that court where they sit today. What else did Harry Reid do? Harry Reid removed the filibuster from the nominations of lower court judges. The nuclear option, they called it. Never been done before. Now, Mitch McConnell returned the favor when it came to the Supreme Court, and that's won in his favor. But it was the Democrats who decided, we're going to change all the rules. We want to pack the courts. If we have to increase the numbers of justices, we'll increase the number of judges. But we've got to get our ideologues on the court. And so that's what they did. Since Majority Leader Harry Reid changed Senate rules to ease the approval of most of President Barack Obama's nominees, Democrats have churned through confirmations of dozens of new judges, Politico, giving them lifetime appointments that will extend the administration's influence for years to come. They don't believe in elections. Power, one-party power, like Justice Jackson. Is Obama trying to pack the court? This is in the Hill. Yeah, and they did. They packed the D.C. Circuit Court. Justice Jackson thinks this is all great because she never said a damn thing. But when Donald Trump is trying to defend the office of the presidency, separation of powers, the Constitution, from what Chuck Schumer and Obama and Biden did to the judiciary, he's the one we have to fear. This is a battle between we, the people, and the ruling class. I've said it over and over again. Donald Trump must win this fight, and we must be heard.
Hey, Sean Hannity here. Hey, click here to subscribe to Fox News YouTube page and catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis. You will not get it anywhere else.